Κυρίες και κύριοι, μπορούμε να περάσουμε τώρα στο πρώτο πάνελ της συζήτησης και δίνω το λόγο στον κύριο Καϊρίδη, Διευθυντή του Δικτύου Ναβαρίνου.
So, if you may come up here now so we can start. Λοιπόν, είναι μεγάλη χαρά να βρισκόμαστε πάλι κοντά μετά από τα 2,5 χρόνια πανδημίας, διαζώσεις, σε αυτόν τον εμβληματικό χώρο που είναι το Ολύμπιον στη Θεσσαλονίκη. Να ευχαριστήσω και εγώ με τη σειρά μου την πολιτιστική εταιρεία και προσωπικά τον Σταύρο Ανδρεάδη για την καταπληκτική δουλειά που κάνει η εταιρεία, που κάνει ο ίδιος στην ηγεσία της εταιρείας όλα αυτά τα χρόνια, ως ένα ζωντανό κύτταρο πολιτισμού της κοινωνίας των πολιτών εδώ στη Θεσσαλονίκη, να στείλουμε το μήνυμα της εξωστρέφειας σε αυτούς τους πολύ δύσκολους καιρούς που ζούμε και χαίρομαι να βλέπω νέα πρόσωπα, νέους ανθρώπους εδώ σήμερα κοντά μας. Είναι μια δύσκολη μέρα, πολλές οι ιώσεις της γρίπης. 10 η ώρα το πρωί, κάπως έτσι μαχμουρλίδικη η πόλη μας. Νομίζω σιγά-σιγά θα έχουμε όλο τον κόσμο που θέλουμε να έχουμε κοντά μας. Ευχαριστώ πολύ τον Δήμαρχο, το Ίδρυμα Κόνραντ Αντενάουερ, το Αμερικανικό Κολέγιο Θεσσαλονίκης, τη TV100, το FM100, την Καθημερινή και βέβαια όλους τους ομιλητές οι οποίοι έχουν έρθει από μακριά. When we were thinking with Stavros what the topics of this symposium should be, the choice was easy this year. A, because we have a war. Who could have thought that we would have a conventional war in the middle of Europe, in Ukraine? It's a subject nobody can avoid. And secondly, because our neighbor to our east has become very active, if not agitated, recently, and has dominated the headlines here in Greece as never before. At least the last 20, 30, 40 years that I have been following Greek-Turkish relations. So Russia and Turkey will be the main subject, followed with a survey that we have with Stratos Fanaras later on. Pavlos Tsimas is coming from Athens, Lukas Tsoukalis. We will comment it, and we will finish at 3 o'clock. Now, there are earplugs at the entrance for those who need translation. The working language of our meeting will be in English, but there is a simultaneous translation for anybody who wishes the translation. We will have a round of initial remarks, and then we can take a round or two of questions from the audience, and by a little bit before noontime, we can finish. We will have a beautiful coffee break outside, and we will continue with Russia for our second panel and the survey in our third panel. Now, we have a group of stellar analysts who will help us navigate this very complex reality that today's Turkey is. Often we talk about it without knowing much, through stereotypes and old truths that not any longer hold. It's a very, very complicated reality. I speak to Americans and I speak to many Europeans. They seem very baffled with what is happening. Sometimes baffled, sometimes angry, sometimes anxious, and certainly here in Athens, in Greece, very, very anxious with what is happening. So I have to my left all of them very dear friends. They have been to Thessaloniki before. Soli Özel is an eminent professor in Turkey at Kadir in Istanbul, in Constantinople, and he has been, like myself, a TV personality, commenting on relations time and again, traveling all over the world. I'm not going to go into the details of the bios of each and everyone. There are the bar codes as you enter, and you can download the program. We are very technologically advanced in this symposium, and we are environmentally friendly. We don't do paper anymore. And then Gareth Jenkins, who for many years was the correspondent of The Economist in Istanbul, has worked on Turkey. Wolf Piccoli, our Italian friend from London, to give us the economic side, recently had hosted Mr. Kilintsaroglu in London in his meeting with foreign investors there, and Ioannis Grigoriadis, who makes us all very proud a wonderful Greek export to Turkey in Ankara, working in the oldest and biggest private university in Turkey, Bilkent University. So we have 3 out of 4 who live in Turkey and who can give us the inside view of Turkey today. I will start with Soli. 7-8 minutes. You can use the floor or the table, or you can...
I'll just stay here. I'll just stay here.
Stay here, yes, good. It's always safer to stay here. And to give us the first scoop of what's going on in the mind of Mr. Erdogan and in Turkish politics these days as we're heading towards elections. Soli, the floor is yours.
First of all, good morning. I have to say this is an impressive crowd for a 10 o'clock in the morning beginning. So whatever else you would all be doing, thank you for coming. It is a great pleasure for me to be in Thessaloniki. I think it was either 4 or 5 years ago I was here again for the forum. And I am from Izmir or Smyrna, and the similarities between the two cities are just remarkable, quite frankly. I feel at home. I'll talk about the elections. I'll just briefly deal with at the end with what foreign policy things are. Don't be anxious. There is a lot of bravado on both sides. We talk the talk, not necessarily walk the walk, although at times that occurs as well. But let me get to, first of all, the agenda of 2023 for Turkey. Since last year, actually, as of 2022, and maybe as of 2021, the common histories of the two countries have actually come to the surface. The bicentennial of your independence, and then the centennial of what you call the Great Asia Minor tragedy, and for the Turks, of course, the independence war and the creation of the republic. And in 2023, of course, Turkey will celebrate the centennial of the republic. 2023 will also be, coincidentally or not, a year of elections in Greece, in Turkey, and not a small matter also in the Greek part of Cyprus, or the Cyprus Republic. And that may actually be an occasion to lower anxieties, or it may be a reason for augmenting those anxieties. So Turkey goes, maybe the difference in the Turkish elections is that we do go, as far as I'm concerned, into an existential election. The results of these elections may very well determine what kind of country Turkey is going to be, whether or not the original Republican project will continue, or it will be altered beyond recognition once the 20-year-old AKP rule is extended by at least another 5 years. And I think the public understands, at least in its guts, the importance of these elections. But unfortunately, the political system does not respond to the importance of these elections, certainly not so far. Turkey has now been governed by a sui generis presidential system since 2018, 4 years. It is a very autocratic, no checks and balances system. Some Turkish scholars call it a sultanist system, which I think is kind of a misnomer. I mean, it's appealing, but I think it's a misnomer because the sultans did have some checks and balances. It's a system which has, in my judgment, as its most important weakness, a governance problem. Authoritarianism by itself is not really the issue. It's whether or not the system functions in the way, let's say, it functioned in Korea, in Taiwan, or elsewhere when they were being run by very authoritarian governments. Its rules are not fixed. We don't know them exactly. And the independence of the judiciary and the relevance of the legislature have actually been done away with. And it is increasingly intrusive in all parts of life, and it is increasingly intrusive in the economy, which was until about 4 years ago, or 3 years ago, the only bright side of a very extended rule. It is true that after 20 years, there is a drop in support for our president, Mr. Erdogan, and his ruling coalition among the public. The negative opinion about Mr. Erdogan, people who say we will never vote for him again, is at about 54%. But forgive me, I am not a great fan of making political analyses by polls. I mean, look at the number of times the polls have actually misled us in the past few years. But there's got to be some fatigue. So if it's not 54%, then probably it is 50 or maybe 45%, which is not really insignificant. But the problem today that we have is when the country is truly ripe for a change, with an inflation rate officially at 85 and unofficially probably around 150%, when your educated secular Turk such as myself is basically losing economic ground as I just breathe. I don't have to do much, actually. And a lot of people are suffering. The poverty rate has increased considerably. You would have expected that the opposition would actually be surging, that, you know, there would be no question in anyone's mind as to what the outcome of that election was going to be. And it is true that the opposition still thinks the conditions are so bad that they're automatically going to be winning, but that is not what the polls, much as I may not trust them all that much, say. In a way, my formulation is, it is highly likely that Mr. Erdogan can lose the election. By the way, we'll have two elections. We'll elect the president and we'll elect the legislature. And since, given the system, the presidential one is more important, Mr. Erdogan can lose the election. The question we have is not whether or not he can lose the election. The question we have is, can the opposition actually win the election? And that, of course, concentrates the minds on the issue of the candidate, and the issue of the candidate has not yet been resolved. The front runner does not inspire much confidence, or certainly is not an inspirational figure. And the fact that the decision has not yet been made by the opposition, which actually brought itself together around the so-called round table of six parties, 2 major and 4 minor parties got together about 9 months ago, and they have constituted themselves, as in Hungary, as an opposition bloc, but they still do not have a candidate. And they don't yet have a convincing or a mobilizing political program either. So I can give you some figures. In a one-on-one contest, Mr. Erdogan loses to almost all candidates, except that Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu, the frontrunner today, the leader of the CHP, is not as certain to win. It is also suggested by at least 2 polls that should Mr. Kılıçdaroğlu be the candidate, there may be a chunk of the electorate that may not just bother to go to the... Oops, I'm already done. Okay, fine. I'll take 1 more minute then. I can answer questions about the elections later. Now, in foreign policy, I would draw your attention to the newly appointed Turkish ambassador. Turkey and Greece have been negotiating those exploratory talks. There had already been 60 rounds with no leaks. And if they're continuing, they must be talking about something. And I suppose they may have even come to an agreement on some issues. And the person who has just been appointed ambassador in Athens is someone who has been there since the beginning. There is probably not many other diplomats in the Turkish diplomatic corps today who are actually in command of all the facts about the Aegean issues and bilateral Turkey-Greek issues. And there is no sense that I have anyway that he is hawkish on those matters. So I think on both sides, the continuation of the exploratory talks suggests a willingness to at least keep things going at a certain level, but whether or not there is a political will, strong enough political will to actually resolve the problems remains a big question. But talk aside, I personally do not anticipate something that we might all come to regret happening, in spite of the fact that electoral politics may raise the tensions and stuff. Turkey has been making great moves to normalize the relations or to rebuild the bridges that itself has burnt. Relations with the UAE, accused of masterminding or underwriting the coup attempt in 2016. Saudi Arabia, whose prince actually ordered the murder of a Saudi American journalist in the consulate in Istanbul. Relations with Egypt, which for the last 11 years has been basically the evil incarnate in the minds of our leader, and Israel, of course, which is always the bad guy on any given occasion. Those relations have now been kind of repaired. I would argue, however, that the Turkey that has actually made those moves is a lot weaker in these relations than it was when it actually broke those relations, and we will see the results of that. Finally, the Ukraine war served Turkey well, and I think by and large this government managed the diplomacy of that war rather competently, and Turkey has seen some benefits from it either. On the other hand, its relations with its Western allies remain problematic. Within NATO, Turkey is a political problem because it vetoes Finland and Sweden's accession at a very critical moment. On the other hand, militarily, it is as loyal an ally, a member of NATO as actually you can get. However, this lack of confidence, lack of trust has manifested itself recently at the G20 summit when the bombs were dropped, or the missiles fell on Poland, and there was great anxiety, real, well-founded anxiety as to what that might lead to. The members of NATO and G7 who were present in Bali for the G20 summit were called to a meeting by President Biden. Turkey is a member of NATO. Mr. Erdogan was present in Bali for the G20 summit. He was not invited. He curtly said that he was only invited to important meetings. I don't know what the level of importance was of a few bombs dropping on Poland. But that shows, and then there was a rumor that he was invited but refused to go. In either case, there is a lack of trust, and if that will have to be repaired, and after 2023, this will be one of the questions that will have to be resolved. Thank you. Sorry that I extended.
Wonderful. Before I give the floor to Gareth, I want to thank Minister Kalafatis on his way out, and Ambassador, US Ambassador Mr. Junis, a dear friend, for being with us and honoring us with their presence this morning. There are very many important people. Everybody is important. Lukia Sarandi, the head of the Industrialist Association here in Thessaloniki, Panos Vlachos, the president of American College of Thessaloniki, and many, many other dear friends. And now I turn to Gareth Jenkins. I have two very specific questions, just as a framework, but you can say whatever. The one has to do, we talked often about a divided Turkey, internally divided Turkey, that makes it even more anxious and nervous. How divided is Turkey? You've been there for 32 years now. You have been watching Turkey's developments up close and personal. This is the one. And the second is, Economist, for example, the journal you used to work for, was very supportive of Erdogan in the beginning. And there was this idea that we are dealing with a liberal reformer, a Europeanist. Everything has gone up in flames. Erdogan has shown a completely different face recently. Why the change? And what is the real face? What is the real Erdogan we have to deal with? Yes, Gareth.
Thank you very much. Actually, I worked for the Economist Intelligence Unit, not the Economist magazine. That was somebody else. I've always been very critical and negative about Erdogan, and I'm afraid I'm going to be even more so now. As Dimitris said, I've been in Turkey actually since 1989. I've never been so worried about what's going to happen as I am now. I wish I could be more optimistic. At the end, I'm going to try to one positive note, so I don't be too negative. Everything now is, for Erdogan, is focused on the elections. One of the interesting things, I've been following Erdogan since 1993, and through his time as mayor of Istanbul, and when the AK Party came to office in 2002, and when they came to power in any real sense, I think after 2007 elections. I don't think they were really in power for the first 5 years when they were in office. And one of the interesting changes has been, Erdogan, of course, served time in prison for a speech he made out in the wilds of Siirt. And after that, he became very cautious, particularly very cautious about antagonizing the military. They had a system of military tutelage at that time. And once he realized he no longer needed to fear the military, he became increasingly confident to the extent now where he's hubristic. During their first years in office, of course, there was corruption. The form of corruption changed, but it persisted. And of course, I think it happens with any party which remains in power for any length of time. It got more and more. And one of the worrying things for me in the recent years is how flagrant it's become. There's been no attempt to hide how corrupt the regime is. And Erdogan, with his confidence now, we see, as Soli mentioned, these about turns in foreign policy. It's almost Orwellian, if you know your 1984. You know, we're friends with Saudi Arabia. We've always been friends with Saudi Arabia. This kind of narrative you get in the Turkish media. And Erdogan, at the beginning, I said he was cautious, but he was also thinking long term. And one of the other things that's changed is how short term he now thinks. And at the moment, his short term goal is winning the next elections. I don't think he thinks beyond that. I think Wolf's going to talk more about the economy, but you can see it very strongly in the economy. There are problems building up, and Erdogan is just focused on muddling through, trying to shield as much as possible the Turkish electorate from the economic downturn, just so he can get elected again. When we had this transition to the presidential system in 2018, I was expecting there to be something like, if you think in terms of a human body, a new head being grafted onto the body in terms of institutions. The executive would move from the parliament to the presidency, and so you'd have all the institutions still there, but you'd have the presidency at the head of it. What we've seen, I think, is something more like institutional decapitation, where the presidential authority has now become isolated from a lot of the apparatus of state. And physically, if you go to Ankara and see this monstrous palace on the edge of the city, as well as institutionally, and I think also intellectually and psychologically, you have a presidency now which is divorced, isolated from everything else that's going on. And with that has come a real dearth of and decline in expertise going into foreign policy making. We haven't had so many disasters recently, and as Soli said, I think, much as I dislike the regime, I think they've handled the situation with the Ukraine-Russian war relatively well. We have a lot less expertise, though, going into decision-making, and a deinstitutionalization also of decision-making, because so much is now concentrated in Erdogan's own hands, which then makes all of Turkish policy basically dependent on a personality as much as anything else. Coming to your question about divisions in Turkey, as I said, I've never been so worried as I am now. I'm Welsh. Even in Wales, of course, we have our murderers and rapists and all kinds of other unpleasant people. And Turkey has been no exception to that. I wasn't in Turkey during the 1970s when there were very severe social divides between leftists and rightists. But in the time I've been in Turkey, I've never seen so much division, so much tension in Turkish society, and it being actively fueled by the administration. As I'm sure a lot of you have been doing the last couple of weeks, we got knocked out in the group stages, so we didn't have a lot of interest recently, but I was watching the World Cup in Turkey, and it's on the TRT, the government-controlled television and radio station. And then you break for adverts, and you see the adverts. Going back 10 years, there was this very famous serial on Turkish television, Valley of the Wolves. Completely imbecilic plotline, terrible acting, but all paranoia about all foreign conspiracies against Turkey. And now, if you turn on Turkish television, and there were new ones being advertised in the break between when I was watching the football, you see these all of the time. You see very xenophobic, often implicitly or sometimes even explicitly anti-Semitic. The West is always trying to divide us. Those who are opposed to us are fifth column for the West. And when you go back to the system of military tutelage, of course it was an oppressive system, but it was the state oppressing the population. And now you've got a lot more of this this tension, this hatred, this vitriol, this poison moving into Turkish society. Not just with Erdogan's speeches. And he talks every day. I don't know how he finds time to do any other work. Not only in the speeches of for example, his very competitive interior minister, but also in these kind of cultural things, if you can use that word to describe a television series. And through the media, which of course Erdogan now almost completely controls. And this is, I think, very, very dangerous. When I first arrived completely unfairly, I was, as a Westerner, I've suffered kind of positive racial prejudice. In the last few years, I have a lot more, it's verbal, thankfully, a lot more negative racial prejudice. And I know my American friends in Istanbul, they suffer even more. But even more dangerous is how Erdogan supporters are not only regard the opposition supporters, but are being taught how to regard the opposition supporters as lackeys of America, of these great conspiracies that are trying to divide Turkey. And that's, I think, very dangerous when we go forward. I don't know at the moment what's going to happen in the elections. As Soli was saying, we have Kılıçdaroğlu as the most likely opposition candidate for the presidency. Polls suggest Erdogan's likely to win, and Erdogan tends to do better as the elections near. He's the most, even though he doesn't do anything for me, he's the most effective political rhetorician that I've seen in my time in Turkey. Of course, his control over the media also plays a very major role in being able to influence voters' opinions. And it looks at the moment that if he's likely to be able to use these advantages to secure another term. I hope he doesn't, but that's how it looks at the moment. Even if the opposition managed to take control of the assembly, they're unlikely to win enough seats to be able to change the constitution or to put constitutional changes to a referendum in order to change back to a parliamentary system. If Erdogan wins again, it's going to be very, very negative. All the problems I think we have now are just going to become even worse. But I'm also concerned if the opposition wins. I'm concerned about what Erdogan is likely to try to do, how the opposition how the government supporters are likely to regard opposition supporters, and whether we may have some social arrest. So there's concerns, I think, for both outcomes. And just very briefly to conclude, because I did promise I'd be a little bit positive, I spent a lot of time going to the Kurdish areas, and in the last few weeks, particularly as the main Kurdish party is facing a closure case in the Constitutional Court, I quite often have people saying to me, will there be a lot of unrest in the southeast? The answer is no. The PKK, the militant Kurdish organization, is probably weaker now than it's been any time in the last 20-odd years. And in the southeast, there's absolutely no desire to return to the fighting and devastation that occurred in the cities in 2015, 2016. So even though I think the Kurds are more distant than they've ever been from Ankara, I certainly see a lot more alienation from Ankara than I've ever seen before. There's no desire to take that into violence. But that's, at the moment, the only positive thing I can think about going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. And now I turn to the economic political side with Wolf Piccoli, who is heading Teneo Intelligence, one of the largest, maybe the largest political risk analysis organization in the world, to give us his scoop, especially on the economic side. We often hear about an imminent collapse of Turkey's economy that never happened. Somehow it has proven much more resilient, defying statistics and expectations and predictions to the contrary. So I wonder, what is the secret of Turkey's economy? How much of a factor can it be for the Turkish election and for Turkish politics in general following the elections? Let me remind our audience that Erdogan came to power because of an economic collapse, the IMF intervention back in 2000, 2001, right? And based his political hegemony on growth, the big growth of the first years, right? Wolf.
Okay, let me turn this thing on. Let me start from the end. How I look at all of this, how I look at Turkish politics, Turkish economy over the next 12 months or so.
Take it in front of you. Yeah?
Okay. When I look at Turkey, over the last 20 years, I look in the following way. I will never underestimate Erdogan's ability to come out with some new tricks, initiative, whatever, to gain the leverage. And I will never underestimate the ability of the opposition to screw up. Okay? That is how I look at Turkey. So now, let's start with the economy. This election is mainly about the economy. It's about the economy, it's about everything else, it's about inflation, and we'll talk about that. It's about jobs, it's about inequality, and it's about rule of law, which is part of the economy at the end of the day. So, since late last year, Erdogan has been pursuing what he calls a new economic model. A model which is not a model, and is neither new. It's a crazy economic experiment, okay? So, where are we now? Just give you some figures to put things into context. So the central bank net reserves, if we exclude the swaps, is negative 54 billion. The current account deficit this year will be around $45 billion. I'm talking dollars here, not Turkish liras. The debt that the country is facing over the next 12 months, private sector, public sector together, is around $185 billion. It's slightly below the GDP of Greece, if you want to put things into perspective there. Inflation, as Soli mentioned, officially is 85%, most likely is double. Food inflation in November was 100% year on year. Think about this. When you're going shopping every day, you don't know how much it's going to cost buying basic items like food. I can go on. Still, as Dimitris alluded, the model is muddling through. How has Erdogan managed to keep this going despite all this madness, basically? He's pursuing economic policy that goes against gravity, basically. He has been doing lots of things. Lots of regulatory measures. So if you're an exporter in Turkey now, 40% of the revenues you are gaining in foreign currency, you are obliged to sell them to the Turkish banks, to the Turkish central bank, in exchange for which they give you some nice Turkish lira. Okay? If you are an exporter and you call your private bank and you are trying to get $1 million because you need it for your operation, you will get a phone call from the central bank asking why you need $1 million. Okay? Just give you some examples here. If you look at the balance of payment of the Central Bank of Turkey, in the last 9 months, there is one interesting entry. It's called net error and omissions. And the net error omission over the last 11 months, was worth $24 billion. 70% of the current account deficit is covered by net error and omission. What is net error omission? Well, we don't know. In the past, and it's not the first time we see it, we saw a similar amount of money coming into the Turkish economy in 2018 after significant currency crisis, that time triggered by Trump. Is basically, the idea is that it's Turkish corporate repatriating money they have allocated abroad, okay? Maybe, but also there is Russian money, and maybe money from somewhere else. So net error omission is basically helping to save the day. It's a very important source of currency. Together with that, we have seen all sorts of regulatory measures, moral suasion, and so on. And also, let's not forget one thing. Like in any economic crisis, there are losers, and in this case, there are plenty of losers in Turkey, mainly the low income more than anybody else, but there are also winners. Turkish corporates in 2018, they had a huge amount of debt in dollars, FX, mainly dollars. They sold it, and they transformed that into Turkish lira. When inflation is running at 85% and you have a huge amount of debt in Turkish lira, you are having a ball. You won the lottery. Your debt is disappearing very, very quickly. So yes, the economy is a sore point, but there also, I will not underestimate here that they are also winners. Now, what is Erdogan going to do? So Soli alluded to the fact that the opposition doesn't have much of a strategy. Totally agree. I had the pleasure to meet plenty of them over the last couple of weeks. Whereas Erdogan has got a strategy, okay? And has got a strategy that has been evolving for some time. So we have seen electoral engineering. We're changing, they changed electoral threshold, they changed electoral constituency, changes the composition of the body who will be overseeing the vote whenever the election takes place. We have seen crackdown on the media, most recently in social media, law. We have seen Erdogan triggering polarization whenever he wants to. We have seen foreign policy statements against all sorts of neighbors, basically aggressive to trying to instill some sort of national pride and rally around the flag. And what we're going to see, for me, what is critical is what we're going to see between now and the vote. So this month, we're going to see two things. Minimum wage. The minimum wage in Turkey is important, very important. So there are 32 million people employed in Turkey. Out of 32, 22 are wage earners. 5 million of them are civil servants, which are separate category. So we have 17 million people left, okay? Out of these 17 million people left, 50% on average salary is the minimum wage, okay? In the European Union, the average is 4% of the workers, okay? So the minimum wage here will be obviously bumped up significantly before the end of this year. From the current 5,500 Turkish lira net, which is around $300, if you want to think about that, most likely might go even double. And I'm not sure whether they will do another minimum wage hike before the vote. We're also going to create 5 million new pensioners, okay? This was against some of the IMF measures that were implemented in 2009, if I remember well. Well, we're going to facilitate the exit of lots of people from the working sector to become pensioners. After this measure, for every 1.2 workers in Turkey, people in active work, you're going to have one pensioner, okay? So in the budget for 2023, 80% of the gas for households is subsidized by the government. 50% of the electricity is subsidized by the government. That costs $30 billion, by the way, okay? There is also a legal case pending against Imamoglu, which might force him out if he decides to run. If he ever thought about running as a president, there is a legal case which should start on the 14th of December. There is a closure case against the Kurdish.
Decided on the 14th.
Yeah, exactly. And if he's sentenced for more than a year, he will be banned from political activity, okay? There is a closure case against the Kurdish party. So there is plenty here that Erdogan can play with to try to gain the upper edge. Final point from me, what about the opposition? So we are still waiting for a program. Then they need to put together a coalition protocol on how to split, on how to work together. They need to decide the candidate. They need to decide the list as well. Okay? There is plenty the opposition here has to do. But most importantly, in my view, it's, first of all, we don't really know what they want to do about the economy. That is still a huge question mark. But secondly, regardless of identity of the candidate, for me will be crucial if the opposition is able to portray a sense of unity. Meaning, regardless who is the candidate, they need to make very sure they give that there is a sense of unity, that all the 6 parties together are convinced and they are behind this person. Because if that is not the case, I think regardless of the identity of the person, then his profile, because he's always a man, he's not a woman, will be immediately undermined. And I'm going to stop it there.
Thank you. Thank you, Wolf. It always helps to have an Italian to understand other people's troubles, I guess. So let me now turn to Ioannis. Ioannis Grigoriadis, an eminent Greek scholar working in Turkey. I don't know how easy it is these days. If it is not, you will tell us. And my opening question has to do with what Wolf just said. Is Greece part of Erdogan's tricks to win the election? Would it be? Or is just part of the general anti-Western, anti-imperialist, anti-liberal, over-nationalistic kind of discourse, and we leave it at that? Or is it something more dangerous in his planning, thinking, strategy, apart from everything else that you want to talk to us, Yanni?
Thank you very much. Καλημέρα σας. Αφού πρώτα ευχαριστήσω τους διοργανωτές, την Πολιτιστική Εταιρεία Θεσσαλονίκη, το Δίκτυο Ναβαρίνο, το Ίδρυμα Adenauer για την πρόσκληση, θα συνεχίσω την εισήγησή μου στα αγγλικά. So, good morning to everybody. I will answer the question regarding Greece towards the end of my short opening remarks. My plan was to talk a bit about the possible swing voters in the upcoming elections, because we talk about how important these elections are going to be, and we talk about a very polarized society. So I think it's important to look into some population groups within Turkey that are going to be critical as far as the outcome of this election is concerned, because for many years the political hegemony of Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been based on the fact that he considered that Turkish society is about 60%, 65% conservative, and the remaining is secular. So if this dividing line, this fault line remains, he has a lot of leverage, and he can win elections more than once, which he did. But now we see some cracks, some leaks in this. So I would like to look into some of these points and try to speculate whether these are going to be consequential for the upcoming elections. And of course, the role of foreign policy is important in that respect. And I would concur with what the other speaker said, that the economy, which used to be the strong card of Erdogan and kind of contributed to his political hegemony, has proven to be a very weak point now, to some degree shifting attention to identity issues, which always were there. But foreign policy has become increasingly a matter of domestic political manipulation. And in that respect, Greece plays some role, so I will also answer that. But I would like first to highlight what are the focal points of the upcoming political developments. The first is the extent to which that the coalition of the opposition is going to attract conservative voters. There have been new parties, the party of Babacan, the party of Davutoglu, that failed to deliver what was anticipated, a considerable chunk of the conservative voters that used to vote for AK Party. The EE party has been more successful. The party of Meral Akşener has proven quite important in shifting this 60 to 40 balance against the opposition by moving some conservative voters from the government coalition to the opposition. But of course, This gain came with a sort of significant cost that the opposition has a lot of difficulty in addressing another key voting group in Turkey, which is the Kurdish minority. And if we look into how the municipal elections gave these important victories to the opposition, it's also because of the fact that the Kurdish communities in Istanbul and Ankara did vote for the opposition. So the opposition has to find a way to appeal to the Kurdish population of the country, which is itself diverse. So there are the conservative Kurds, the secular Kurds, the rural, the big city, the sort of the metropolitan populations, without alienating the conservative nationalist voters who consider anything about the Kurdish issue to be a national security issue. And of course, the government has been trying to drive a wedge in that process, so it tries to do everything possible so that the opposition does not appeal to the Kurdish population and to the HDP, but in a very cynical sort of manner, they're also trying to build their own bridges on a completely different basis. So as soon as they consider that the opposition is not going to ally with the Kurds, they would try to build very kind of instrumental relationships and sort of agreements on a local level, which is going to shift some Kurdish votes to the government coalition. So this is very, very important. So the Kurdish vote is going to be crucial. And of course, we also need to consider the possibility of abstention. So it's not that everybody's going to choose. Choosing is also by staying at home. And this works in all elections. And this is going to work with other important population groups that I will include in my presentation. A big difference between Turkey and Greece or Italy or the UK or Germany is that Turkey has a very young population. So this means a lot from the elections point of view as well. There are more than 1.2 million people entering election age on a yearly basis. So like after 5 years, you have more than 5 million new voters. That, of course, comprises a big enigma for opinion poll experts because they haven't voted before. And one needs to look into their expectations, their wishes for the future, and of course, it's very important for the parties to appeal to that very special group of voters, right? So what we now know is that the opposition, the youth, is very much oriented towards the West. So this whole project of the AK Party to build a conservative Islamist generation has largely failed, and this is something that the president himself has admitted more than once, that we may have achieved economic or political hegemony, but cultural hegemony is not something we've achieved. But on the other hand, as Soli alluded before, the opposition fails to provide an attractive alternative. So there's nothing exciting about what the opposition says. It's more of old things, old issues, and there is a very big problem there for the opposition, especially if the leader of the Republican People's Party is going to be the candidate. So he has been trying to change his political profile in a couple of initiatives in the last couple of months, but this doesn't seem to be delivering significant results. This might be different with some of the other possible candidates of the opposition. So, particularly the mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, appears to be quite attractive and popular to the youth. The result of his spectacular second-round victory in Istanbul was also due to the fact that the youth voted for him in the second round. You remember that he had a very thin victory in the first round, which was cancelled by the election board, but then the second round proved to be a catastrophe for the government party. That was because of the fact that he was able to appeal to the youth. So looking into this is going to be crucial and important. And I think it's also important to see how this is going to develop to the extent that Erdogan is going again to employ identity politics on the way to the election. So we talk about the headscarf issue. Soli mentioned about 2 elections. We may have a referendum as well. So there's a discussion about the possible constitutional referendum on the headscarf issue, which is a topic that has popped up out of a not very wise, in my opinion, initiative of the opposition to appeal to the conservative public opinion. And then Erdogan took it on and said, okay, we'll change the constitution on this line. So these initiatives may consolidate the conservative core voters of Erdogan and may prevent some of them to abstain from vote, because this is something that may be happening with the conservatives as well. Those who cannot vote for CHP for cultural or identity reasons, but they may decide not to show up for the first time. This could be a major loss. But on the other hand, if this kind of seculars versus Islamists or the LGBTI right discussions that have also been introduced in the public discourse in Turkey is going to consolidate some of the conservative voters on the side of Erdogan, they may bring a big loss on the side of the youth, which actually might be bigger, in my opinion, than what the coalition, the government coalition may be anticipating. So, to conclude with my questions regarding, I mentioned foreign policy and where Greece plays into this. As I said in the beginning, I do think that foreign policy is going to be present in the way to the election, given to the fact that Turkey has been able to maintain a stronger international image over the last couple of years for a number of reasons we can discuss in the questions. It's also because the fact that the international public community has receded. Turkey has been able and willing to exercise extraterritorial force on a number of different occasions. And this is something that the Turkish public opinion is favorable to. And of course, the idea of Turkey as an independent global or regional player is something that is quite popular across the spectrum of Turkish public opinion. So in that respect, Greece didn't appear for many years in the rhetoric of Tayyip Erdogan. Actually, the irony is that for some years the opposition used to criticize him for being soft on Greece, of not raising the Turkish positions on Greek-Turkish relations. But this has shifted for a number of reasons. The Turkey-Libya memorandum, the improvement of relations between the United States, France, and Greece, this whole development of alliances or alignments between Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean with Egypt and Israel has brought Greece to the forefront, but Greece appears really in the forefront as part of Turkey's anti-American rhetoric, because anti-Americanism has also become very popular and very strong. The idea that the United States are not happy with the rise of Turkey as a regional actor, and Greece is the kind of the local agent of American interests. And this is something that Turkey is not going to tolerate or accept. This discourse is quite popular and strong, and I think that this is the main reason why we have all this anti-Greek rhetoric that has mounted up over the last couple of months. Given the fact that we have elections in Turkey, Greece, and Cyprus, I would expect that this rhetoric is going to continue at least until the election, so we need to be aware of possible risks, and it's important to maintain channels of communication so that misunderstandings are kind of addressed at the earliest possible moment. But other than that, I do not think that Greece is an important chapter in Turkish foreign policy. Turkey has a lot of issues, and it has a lot of important domestic issues that it has to address. And winning the elections is going to be the most important issue that Turkish government and Turkish politics is going to be about in the coming months. So I'll stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I will make now a round of 1-minute questions to each of you as the audience prepares for their questions. So think of your questions and I will get back to you. And I will start with Soli very, very quickly. I want to insist, since we are here in Greece, in front of a Greek audience, on the Greek-Turkish issue. Has there been a qualitative difference in Turkey vis-à-vis Greece recently, or is it part of the same old kind of agenda? We've seen, as Ioannis just mentioned, that Greece is much more up in the news in ways that it wasn't before. We've seen these kind of threats and dispute over Greek sovereignty of Greek islands in the Eastern Aegean in ways that we did not see before. I just want to be very specific and with your experience, invite you to make a comment on how real, how part of a theatrics, how dangerous this is for regional stability, I wonder.
Look, there's something in my dealings with, in Turkey-Greece relations. You don't seem to ever look at what you do. For me, Prime Minister Mitsotakis' speech to Congress was a great achievement. Why did he have to include the F-16s? Remember, this escalation began after Mitsotakis brought up the issue of F-16s in the US Congress. And I have no idea what Mitsotakis and Erdogan spoke together when Mitsotakis visited Turkey and got COVID. But for Erdogan, obviously I don't have access to Erdogan or his entourage. For Erdogan, somehow what he did there was a breach of their understanding of how they were going to conduct the relations, okay? If that is so, then you've got to look at yourself and see whether you have contributed to the escalation or Greece has contributed to the escalation of relations. In the last month or so, again, as Ioannis reminded me this morning, you know, this song, I May Come Suddenly One Night, has again reverted to Cyprus, to Syria rather than to Greece. My sense is that Americans have also gotten wind of the fact that this escalation, which may be more rhetorical than real, may end up with one party slipping and then we all of us finding ourselves in a very dangerous situation. Oh, there are plenty of conspiracy theories. Alexandroupolis is really where the United States will start its invasion of Turkey and will use Greece. I really don't think this has resonance in the right-minded public. And I find this to be part of the electoral process and the fact that Erdogan believes that he has been crossed by Prime Minister Mitsotakis.
Thank you. Now, thank you, Soli, and for the honesty.
That was the point about the appointment of the ambassador. There are plenty of other people who could have been appointed here, who would have given a very different message.
So it's a positive step.
I thought I explained why I thought it was a positive.
Good. No, I need to underline that because. Now, Gareth, we speak in this country a lot. Traditionally about the successes of Turkey's foreign policy, you know, and there is an underlying admiration that Turkey manages to be of both worlds, play with everybody, etc., etc. But I want to invite you to speak to us about the failures of Turkey's foreign policy, especially vis-à-vis Egypt, and especially now that Soli mentioned America. What is the relationship with America today? We have this dispute over F-16s and the rest, the US Congress, some very hostile rhetoric on the part of some American congressmen and senators like Menendez and so on and so forth. So the failures.
Sorry. To start with the US, I think one of the problems is, and the US is not alone in this, of course the EU and a lot of European countries were the same, there was so much positivity about Erdogan when he took office. And a lot of it based, I think, on a very shallow examination of what kind of person he was and what kind of agenda he had. And also a very shallow understanding of some of the dynamics that are very, very long-term inside Turkish society. And of course, there was a strong relationship with the US, which was largely driven by the Gulen movement initially. But under the George W. Bush administration, there were some very close links between like the Gülenists and some of the evangelical Christian groups, which were very influential in Washington. And then when there was this realization that Erdogan, first of all, you hear people say that Erdogan changed. Erdogan didn't change. Erdogan just became more confident. But this perception that Erdogan had changed, and I think then there was a sense of betrayal, because particularly in the George W. Bush administration, they were looking for a so-called moderate Muslim country which they could hold up as a counter to people going to the radicalization of what was then Al-Qaeda. So I think that there's that sense. But now, of course, when you go to Washington, famously, the members of Congress have very little understanding of what's actually going on in the world. And it's often quite alarming to talk to people there, but they have this very simplistic idea now stuck in the head about Erdogan. Him being a dictator and being very anti-Western. These are both basically true, of course. But I've seen a lot of examples where Western perceptions of a leader of a foreign country have gone from positive to negative. I can't think of an example where it's gone the other way. And so I think that perception of Erdogan in Washington now is fixed. And even if he comes out tomorrow and ceases behaving as the way he has behaving, I don't think that will change the perceptions. But from the US perspective, I'm not going to defend US foreign policy, but when you have somebody ever since 2016 saying the US was basically behind a plot to overthrow him with this still largely unexplained coup attempt, it's not surprising that the US is somewhat miffed with him because they know this isn't true. I was in Washington like 4 times after the coup attempt with people from all areas of the state apparatus asking me to explain what happened because I got no idea. But obviously if they were behind it, they would know. So I think this isn't going to change, and they're still going to be very hostile. In terms of the failures, I'm not sure at the moment where it's possible to talk about any real failures in the sense that the process is finished. If you look at what, certainly in some areas, you look at Libya, Turkey's ambitions overreached its actual achievements, but that process isn't completely dead. Turkey still has some influence in Libya. When you look at Syria, of course, Russia has been blocking, more than the US, has been blocking a new military operation into Syria. And I think that is going to turn out to be a failure. And we have now Erdogan talking about, I said earlier, about this Orwellian reversal. Now he's talking about meeting with Assad, which the rebels in Syria quite understandably regard as a betrayal. And that's going to be a huge headache for Turkey going forward. What you're going to do with all of these rebels, a lot of them with very strong radical views who are in Turkish-occupied areas of Syria at the moment. So I think that's going to be a failure, but I don't think it's a failure yet.
Okay. Soli, you want to say something?
On the coup, to the best of my knowledge, the night of the coup, the only ally who called Erdogan was your prime minister, Tsipras. Nobody else did. It was 2:30 in the afternoon in the United States, and nobody bothered to call, whether you like him or not, the duly elected president or the duly elected prime minister of Turkey. Please ask yourself the question, if, let's say, something happened in Hungary or Poland, would that be the case? And when I go to the States and I ask people, what the hell were you doing for all those hours? Oh, there was confusion. Forgive me, that is not an explanation. I'm not suggesting that they were behind it. All I'm saying is 6.5 years after the coup attempt, there is still not a coherent explanation as to why the United States, anybody in the United States, could actually call the president of Turkey.
Thank you. Thank you. Now, Wolf, you are into predictions. I mean, your clients obviously need to know what's going to happen in Turkey in July. And apart from all this talk and talk and talk, they don't have time for this talk. They don't read. They want immediate answers. One answer that I have been given is that Erdogan will be re-elected most probably, and that legislature will pass to the hands of the opposition with a Kurdish vote and actionnaire. Is that so? And if that is the most possible outcome, what does it mean, this divided government between Erdogan, the president, and opposition in the parliament, given the constitution, which is a very bizarre, as Soli explained, constitution for the stability, political stability of Turkey. For some reason, the recent drama seems to be the prelude of even more drama coming up after June. Yes or no?
Maybe. That's not my base case. If I assume for a second here, if I had to put my money now, and again, it's 6 months away, roughly, we still don't know who is the candidate of the opposition. But if you ask me who's going to win the election, I think my money will be on Erdogan. I don't agree on the idea that the opposition, if Erdogan wins the presidency, that the opposition will win a parliamentary majority. I don't think the Turkish voters will split their ticket. Basically, I think when we look at Turkey, the electorate, when we look at the priorities of the electorate, there is always the search for a strong leader. And that is what has helped Erdogan over the last 20 years plus. And that is the problem that Kılıçdaroğlu is facing, because he's not perceived as a strong leader. So I struggle to see how a Turkish voter will vote for Erdogan on one side and vote for the opposition on the other side. If that was going to be the case, meaning I'm wrong, and the opposition wins a parliamentary majority,
it happens to be wrong, right? Sometimes.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Even for
absolutely,
an Italian.
Absolutely. Otherwise, if you're always getting it right, it means that you're not making calls. That is basically the reality. If that is the case, we will be in completely uncharted waters, because the Constitution is being badly written, and the Constitution, the way in which it was written, assumed there was always an alignment between the presidency and the parliamentary majority. So the president obviously can still rule by decree. Erdogan controls the constitutional court. Most of the judges are appointed by him, most of the bureaucracy. But it will be a very difficult system of governance in place. For example, Parliament passes the budget, okay? It's one of the few prerogatives left to the Parliament. What about if Parliament passes a budget without allocating funds to the presidency? How that is going to work? Can you just think about that? And Erdogan's reaction to stand. So it would be, especially in an environment where the economy is basically on its knee and in a very fragile equilibrium, if that is the outcome, then it becomes tricky, difficult for everybody very, very quickly. And most likely, it will not be a sustainable solution. The other thing that we have not mentioned here so far, that Turkey is also facing local election in March 24, okay? So again, we will no sooner, and obviously controlling the big municipalities is key for everybody here. So there is a risk that the country will be, again, in a new electoral cycle very, very quickly as well.
Nice. Now, yes, Gareth.
It's something very briefly on the opposition. If the opposition win a majority in parliament, that's going to be with the Kurdish party, the HDP. Yeah. And so the idea of the opposition being able to cooperate and mount an effective challenge against Erdogan means the HDP has to cooperate with the E party, which is very strongly Turkish nationalist, and they refuse to have anything to do with the HDP.
Yeah. Yes, good. Now, Yanni, we talk a lot about Turkey in Greece, obviously, every day on Greek television. You have been shy in not appearing too much. How do you take the discourse on Turkey from this side of the Aegean? Is it, as Gareth talked about US senators and congressmen, simplistic? And if you were to be on television, what would you say about today's situation to the Greek public, I mean?
Yes. Well, it is quite remarkable how much time the Greek media spent on many aspects regarding Turkey. It is very surprising to see how much information is communicated on details. But I do think that there is some skewedness in the way this information is communicated, because this information tends to reinforce some already existing views. So the information that is going to challenge the mainstream stereotypes about Turkey is not always there. So we may be talking about the real, very outrageous statements about politicians, ministers, threats. But on the other hand, and that's something I would like to respond to your previous point about how an academic can be in Turkey. Turkey is a very diverse and complex society and a very diverse and complex country. So there are like islands of normalcy, islands of sort of very successful performance on economic, academic senses that struggle to survive in this very, very difficult political environment. How sustainable this is, time will tell. I don't think it's very sustainable, and that's why this election is very important. But I would like to make a point to some statements made on Greek media about what is Greece's interest out of this and whether it's good for Greece for Erdogan to be reelected, because Erdogan is the devil Greece knows, while the opposition may be even more nationalistic or more aggressive. I do think that if Greece's interest is to have a neighbor who is struggling to become democratic somehow, I'm not saying that Turkey is going to be a democracy anytime soon, according to the Western standards, even if the opposition wins, the constitution is what it is, it's going to be a very difficult process of recovering some of the losses of the last 10 to 15 years. But I do think that the victory of the opposition will give some breathing space to the pro-democracy, pro-Western forces in Turkey, which in the long term is good for Greece as well. Because otherwise, if this government consolidates its grip, Turkey's relations with the West, Turkey's relations in the Eastern Mediterranean is going to be going into ways that may be posing major risks for the region and for Greece as well. So, thank you.
Questions from our audience, if there are any. Just stand up so I can see you in the dark. Yes, stand up. And we have microphones from our, if you can take the microphone, go around, go around, go around, go around. Giro, yes. Yes, and then I come to you. Anybody else, I'll take them all together. Yes, κύριε Μιλωνά, ωραία. So.
Thank you for today. You have been awesome in giving us information about the geopolitical crisis that we're currently experiencing, the youth. And my question is going to be very straightforward to you, and I would like you to give us a probability of a physical attack in our country, Greece, from Turkey.
Okay. Wonderful. Here, in the front. Ελάτε γρήγορα. Κάτω, κατέβα. No, but I want everybody else. Yes. And the translators. And then Mr. Milonas, and we conclude.
I don't know if I've missed it, but having for over 20 years in touch with the neighbor, doing business import and export, what I cannot understand is the inflation is extremely high. I agree that some parts are gaining of this, but the bigger part is losing. Someone said it's the economy stupid, and I agree that probably Erdogan will win. How did this come into this, and so the people don't agree with the problem of inflation? Thank you.
Okay, the survivor. And Mr. Milonas, you have the last word.
Yes, for Mr. Wolf. There was a saying from Mr. Erdogan that Europeans should take more care for Turkey because Turkey should be considered the China of Europe. What we see is that with this kind of inflation, you mentioned that as well, is that the production sector of Turkey, the industry, which is quite a big part of Turkey, because of the inflation, they have already amortized their investments. And we've seen that the last year with a huge increase of their exports in Europe. Is this a strategy of Erdogan to reinforce its industry by this devaluation of lira, or has nothing to do with it. The result, anyway, is that the Turkish industry has become too powerful and very strong in competition abroad.
I take the last two questions. The economy inflation. So how is Erdogan camouflaging that? He's struggling to do that. First, they're cooking the numbers, okay? So if you take the statistical agency, you pack it with loyalists. So we are thinking is 85%. In reality, is most probably double. Okay, so you cook the numbers. Something that we have seen in this country in 2009. Just to mention that. First.
And west of this country as well. Yes.
Exactly.
In a bigger country to the west of us.
You blame outside. You blame the war. You blame the energy. Sounds familiar? You know, Western policymakers are doing it every day, right? And on top of that, what you do, you hope that by May next year, the 85% that is now will go down to 40% because of the base effect, which is basically feasible. If we assume they're able to keep the exchange rate stable, like they've been doing over the last 4 months, and we assume there are no big external shocks, inflation will go down because of the base effect, the 40%, which you can claim, if you are Erdogan, that is a big success, right? In reality, if you are a Turkish consumer, your monthly inflation is still 4 or 5%, okay? So it's still biting into your wallet, okay? And then what you do on the side, you target the help. So in the budget for 2023, social aid went up by 70%. So if I'm Erdogan, I take care of 50% of the population. The other 50% can actually die because they will never vote for me, okay? So what I do is subsidies, is minimum wage, I create new pensioners, and so on. So I focus everything that I have left in terms of money to specific categories of potential voters, okay? That's the bet here. The game of Erdogan was, the theory of the new economic plan was, we devalue, we export our way out, that way we reduce the current account deficit, and it's a great success. Well, that was complete, to use a technical term, bullshit, okay? Because what has happened is foreign trade deficit has increased by almost 200%. It's 170% to be precise, okay, this year, okay? The current account deficit is 45 billion, which is around 4.5% of GDP. What's the problem here? Turkish exporters, to export, they need to import. They need intermediate goods. With the lira going down, their competitive edge has been undermined because they're paying much more for anything else they need to import. What's the problem with the economic model that their party has been pursuing for the last 20 years? Is a low value add model, a model that was based on a continuous inflow of money from abroad, which now is not happening, and the model that now is completely dated. That is the struggle here. So Turkey can become the China of Europe? No, it's not going to become the China of Europe anytime soon. Its competitive edge, if you compare to countries like Slovakia, for example, or even in North Africa, Tunisia, Morocco, and so on, is becoming thinner and thinner. So that, and indeed now, what is actually interesting, the Turkish exporters are complaining the Turkish lira is too strong and they're struggling to export. That is so we are in it. The whole experiment here is not working on any front, basically. It's only working in Erdogan's mind. That's the drama.
Let's give Soli the last word as the one Turk we have in the table, and we conclude. Yes, okay. Unless you want to say something, I don't know.
I'll say something.
Okay, then Gareth. Yes.
Go ahead.
Yes.
Oh, okay. I'll say it now.
I will have the last word.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Just back with the impact of what's happening in Turkey, the economy on the voters. There are two things. One is the narrative coming out from Erdogan that this is all part of a foreign plot. A lot of, particularly his supporters, believe it. The other thing is, I tend to agree with Soli, you can't put too much faith in opinion polls. But at the same time, when you look at the opinion polls and some of the more detailed data that's coming out, you see that there's a very large number of people who are saying they're undecided, and a disproportionately large number of those are former AK Party supporters. So you have that support which has been kind of loosened, but not yet fully detached. And when you look at the last 20 years, there were some periods of apparent prosperity, and there's the risk that when it comes to the elections, people will say, okay, the AK Party sorted out the economy before, do I take a leap into the unknown and trust my already precarious economic situation with an untried and probably incompetent opposition?
Very quick response on the physical attack probability. I do find this to be very, very low for reasons everybody can understand. Greece is no Syria. Greece is a country with a strong military force, and the risks of such an operation will be impossible for Turkey to manage, especially ahead of elections. So I don't think that this is a realistic choice in the hands of the Turkish government. But I would like to make a point on this discussion about Turkey being China of Europe. It reminded me something we haven't discussed at all today, that Turkey's relations with Russia have raised concerns about Turkey's membership within the Western security and political community. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine has made this issue even more pronounced. And this is something that the new Turkish administration, like Erdogan or the opposition, will have to address very quickly, because this is going to be one of the key issues in the years to come. So recognizing that Turkey has its own interests is one thing, but having Turkey free riding on Western security institutions or Western political institutions while undermining Western strategic and security interests at the same time is something that is not going to be tolerated for very long.
On that note as well, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, this is going to be a very existential elections for Turkey, because a lot of decisions that have been postponed will really have to be made afterwards. And since everybody was interested in the economic thing, you see, Turkey historically has collected a lot of strategic rents, and it also is in a very precarious part of the world. But of course, it also collected some income from the catastrophes that the Americans have created around it. For the last 20 years, we had money coming in from Iraq. We had money coming in from Syria. We now have money coming in from Russia and Ukraine, and probably that explains part of that errors and omissions. And of course, there is trouble in Iran, so money is coming in from Iran. There is money coming in from the Central Asian republics, at least in terms of property investments and stuff. And that, of course, creates an illusion of wealth, which does not really spread to the rest of the country. In fact, the governance problem is an all-inclusive problem. That is, we have a phenomenal, for instance, economy minister. And we have a phenomenally weird economic policy that actually literally undermines Turkish industrial strength. That cannot continue. Now, what will and will not continue, we will only know after the elections. I will differ, and this is my last sentence, differ from Wolf on one point, and that is, if the elections give a victory to the opposition, the recovery in economic terms may be a lot faster than anybody might anticipate. But I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And at this stage, we have to conclude. It's 5 to 12, so we are almost on time. We will be back at 12:20. Στις 12 και 20. There is plenty of coffee outside to refill our bodies with caffeine, to be ready for our panel on Russia, which I promise will be equally fascinating. We covered a lot of ground so far. Thank you for being with us, and thanks to the speaker. A big round of applause. Thank you.